My name is James Miller. I was a sergeant in the 1st Infantry Brigade, the Big Red One, during the Vietnam War in 1967. I was just 19 when I got drafted and shipped off to Vietnam, scared out of my mind, not knowing what to expect. The military called it the jungle, and believe me, that name wasn't an exaggeration. My time in the war was like a blur, but there's one story I can't seem to forget. It haunts me to this day. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, a place where everyone knew everyone else. When I left for boot camp, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I thought I'd be home before I knew it. But that didn't happen. I ended up in Vietnam, stuck in the middle of a war I didn't really understand. All I knew was that I had to fight, survive, and make sure my brothers next to me did too. It was one hell of a time, and the stories that came out of it, well, they're not the kinds of stories you tell just anyone. We were stationed in an area near Siu Chi, just north of Saigon. The place was nothing like the pictures you see in the history books. It was thick with jungle, the kind of jungle that felt like it was alive and watching you. It had a smell to it, a mix of damp earth, sweat, and the occasional burn from the fires we'd light for cooking or warmth. The air was always heavy, and the heat was something you couldn't get used to. It felt like the sun was pressing down on you all the time, but you couldn't show weakness. You couldn't show fear. I remember my first few days there. The sounds of helicopters overhead, the smell of gunpowder, the chatter of the radio. Everything was so real, so different from what I'd imagined. You can read about war, you can hear stories from other soldiers, but when it's your turn to live it, it's like nothing you could ever prepare for. The Big Red One, our brigade, was known for being one of the toughest. We were in it for the long haul, and we knew it. We got used to the endless patrols, the heat, the bugs, and the constant tension of not knowing what was ahead. Every time you moved through that jungle, you had to assume someone was watching. And most of the time, someone was. It was one of those long patrols that changed everything for me. We were out there for what felt like days, just walking, listening, staying alert. You'd never know where the enemy might be hiding. They were good at blending in with the jungle. You could be standing right next to them and not even know it. We were on a mission to secure a small village that had been a known Viet Cong stronghold. The higher-ups didn't know if it was still active, but we were supposed to sweep through and make sure. We'd been in the jungle for days, and morale was starting to drop. The heat was unbearable, and the food was running low. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the feeling of being completely exposed. The enemy knew the land better than we did, and that gave them an edge. One night, we set up camp near a small creek, hoping to rest and catch our breath. I remember sitting there, staring into the water, not really thinking about anything. My mind was numb. The jungle was quieter than usual. It wasn't that there weren't sounds, but everything seemed different. It felt like something was wrong. But when you're out there, you don't always trust your instincts. You learn to keep your guard up, even when everything feels calm. I was sitting next to a guy named Tommy. He was from Texas, a good OL boy, always cracking jokes to keep the mood light. But even Tommy was quiet that night. He was looking around, squinting into the darkness, trying to make sense of the stillness. I caught him wiping his forehead, but there wasn't any sweat. I guess we were all thinking the same thing. Something was off. We didn't know it at the time, but that night we were about to be hit. The enemy had been tracking us, and they had set up an ambush, just waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a typical Viet Cong tactic. They knew the land, they knew how to move silently, and they had all the time in the world to wait for us to make a mistake. Around midnight, we heard the first shot. It was distant, but it was loud enough to send a jolt through every one of us. It wasn't the sound of a rifle. It was a grenade. The air seemed to shift, and before anyone could react, the second blast hit closer, followed by the sharp crack of automatic gunfire. That's when the chaos started. The jungle erupted with noise. I grabbed my M16, my hands shaking, and hit the ground. The blast had come from two sides, and we were pinned down. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't think straight. You don't have time to think in those moments. You just react. I heard Tommy yelling to me, but it was hard to make sense of anything. It felt like the entire world had been turned upside down. I could hear the distinct sound of AK-47s firing from both sides of us. The enemy was closing in fast. The gunfire was relentless. I wasn't sure where to point my rifle. The darkness was thick, and the jungle was alive with sounds of chaos. I remember ducking low, trying to find some kind of cover behind a tree. My heart was still racing, my ears ringing from the explosion. But then, through all the madness, I heard someone screaming. I couldn't tell who it was at first, but the voice sounded like it was coming from the other side of the camp. The firing had stopped for a second, and in that silence, I could hear it, the unmistakable sound of someone in pain. That's when I realized we had a man down. I don't know what came over me, but I couldn't just sit there. I had to do something. I turned to Tommy, who was still crouched next to me, and gave him a look. He nodded, his face as tense as mine, and we both started moving. We couldn't stay where we were, exposed like sitting ducks. The gunfire had died down for a moment, but that didn't mean it was over. In a place like that, you don't wait for silence to make a move. You move when you can. I crawled through the brush, staying low to the ground, trying not to make a sound. The noise of my own heart thumping in my chest was louder than anything else, but somehow I kept going. I had to get to the man who was screaming. I didn't know who it was, but I could tell by the sound that they were in bad shape. Tommy followed close behind me, both of us keeping our rifles ready in case of another ambush. The jungle was thick, the trees blocking what little moonlight there was, and every shadow seemed like it could hide an enemy soldier. I tried to push the fear down, focusing only on the task at hand. There were men in trouble, and we were going to help them. I don't know how long it took, but we finally reached the spot where the sound had come from. I peeked through the bushes and saw a figure, lying on the ground, barely moving. I recognized him immediately. It was Sergeant Miller, our squad leader. He was holding his side, and there was blood soaking through his uniform. He had been hit, and it looked bad. His face was pale, and he was gritting his teeth, trying not to scream as he struggled to keep himself propped up with one arm. The other hand was pressed tight against his side, but it wasn't enough. The blood kept flowing. Without thinking, I rushed forward. Tommy grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back for a moment. "Hold up, Jim. It's a trap," he whispered harshly. I shook my head, not caring. We can't just leave him. We both knew the risks. If the enemy was watching us, if they had set up a second ambush, we were walking straight into it. But I couldn't just leave him there to die. I crawled forward, and Tommy followed reluctantly. When we reached Miller, I could see the pain in his eyes. His face was scrunched, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts. "It's bad, Jim," he whispered through gritted teeth. "I don't think I'm going to make it." I didn't have time to respond. The sound of movement came from the trees. Faint, but enough to make my skin crawl. The enemy was close. "We got to get out of here," I said, looking around frantically for cover. Miller tried to shake his head, but it was clear he couldn't move much. "No time. You need to get out. Take care of the others." His voice was barely a whisper. He was giving up, and I could see it in his eyes. He knew what was coming, but I wasn't about to let him go like that. "I'm not leaving you," I said, gripping his arm and trying to pull him up. Tommy was already looking around, his M16 aimed at every corner of the jungle, checking for any movement. Just as I was getting Miller to his feet, the first shot rang out. It was like everything in the world stopped. My blood ran cold. The bullet whizzed past my head, missing by inches, and I dropped to the ground, pulling Miller down with me. The firefight had started again. This time, it was different. The enemy wasn't just shooting from the trees. They were advancing. I could hear their voices in the distance, muffled but unmistakable. They were coming straight at us. "Stay down," Tommy shouted as he fired back at the enemy, his shots slicing through the night air. The sound of his M16 was deafening, but it didn't stop the approaching Viet Cong soldiers. We had to move, and fast. I knew our best chance was to get back to our original position, where the rest of the squad was. But with Miller injured, there was no way we could move fast enough. I looked around, desperate. The jungle had closed in around us, and I couldn't see a way out. Then I remembered something: the creek. It was close, just a few yards away, and if we could make it there, we'd have some cover. I had no idea how I came up with the idea so quickly, but in that moment, it was the only option that made sense. "Tommy, the creek. We need to get to the creek," I shouted over the noise of the gunfire. Tommy looked at me like I was crazy, but he nodded. Let's move. I hoisted Miller up again, trying to ignore the weight of his limp body against mine. He was still conscious, but barely. His breathing was ragged, and his grip on my arm was weak. With Tommy leading the way, we crawled toward the creek. The sound of the water running was like music in the chaos of gunfire and shouts. We reached the bank, and I helped Miller lower himself into the shallow water, praying it would conceal us from the enemy. We lay there, barely moving, as the firefight raged on around us. The water was cold, but I didn't care. I just wanted to survive. I kept my eyes trained on the jungle, my rifle at the ready. The Viet Cong were getting closer. I could hear their footsteps in the brush. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I thought for sure we were going to be caught. But somehow, the creek seemed to give us some cover. The darkness, the water, and the thick trees, it was all we had. The seconds felt like hours, and my mind kept racing. How long could we stay hidden? How long could we keep them at bay? The answers didn't come easy, but I knew we had to hold on. We had to survive, not just for ourselves, but for the men we left behind. We stayed in that creek for what felt like an eternity. The water soaked through my uniform, chilling me to the bone, but I couldn't think about that. I had to keep my eyes on the jungle, on the faint movements in the shadows. The enemy was close. Too close. I could hear their voices now, speaking in low, clipped tones. They were searching for us, sweeping the area like wolves hunting their prey. I glanced at Tommy. He was crouched just a few feet away, his M16 raised and ready. His eyes met mine for a moment, and in that brief second, I saw the same fear I felt. We both knew how bad this was. Miller was barely holding on, slumped against the muddy bank, his breath shallow and uneven. I had tied a strip of my shirt around his wound to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. We needed a medic. We needed backup. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, there was no cavalry coming to save us. The Viet Cong were getting closer. I could see the glint of their rifles in the moonlight, hear the crunch of their boots on the wet ground. They moved with precision, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. They probably had. My hands tightened around my rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. I didn't want to fire unless I had to. One shot would give away our position, and then we'd be done for. Tommy shifted slightly, his movements slow and deliberate. He pointed to the left, where the jungle thinned out just a bit. I understood what he was saying without words. If we were going to make a break for it, that was our chance. The creek curved around in that direction, offering a natural path to escape. But getting there without being spotted was another story. I turned to Miller. His eyes were half closed, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Hang in there, Sarge," I whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear. He didn't respond, but his fingers twitched, just slightly. That was enough for me. He was still fighting, even if his body was failing him. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like a lifetime. The enemy soldiers were so close now that I could see their faces, their dark uniforms blending into the jungle. They were scanning the creek, their eyes sharp and searching. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. The water rippled slightly as one of them stepped closer, his rifle raised, his gaze sweeping the bank. And then something happened, a noise, distant but loud enough to grab their attention. It sounded like gunfire, but it wasn't coming from us. It was coming from back in the direction of our camp. The enemy soldiers froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. For a moment, they hesitated, exchanging quick words I couldn't understand. Then, just like that, they started moving, heading back toward the camp. I let out a shaky breath, my body sagging with relief. We weren't out of the woods yet, but we had a window, a small, precious window to escape. "Now," Tommy hissed, his voice barely audible. "We go now." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Miller under the arms, hauling him up as gently as I could. He groaned in pain, his body limp, but he didn't resist. Tommy took point, leading the way along the creek, his rifle at the ready. I followed, half dragging, half carrying Miller as we moved through the water. The jungle seemed quieter now, but that didn't mean we were safe. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound like a potential threat. My muscles burned from the effort of carrying Miller, but I didn't dare stop. Tommy kept glancing back at us, his eyes scanning the trees, his body tense. He was ready for anything, and I tried to be too. We followed the creek for what felt like miles, the water turning shallow and muddy as we went. Finally, we reached a small clearing, a patch of open ground where the jungle thinned out. Tommy raised a hand, signaling for us to stop. He crouched low, peering through the trees, his eyes sharp and focused. "Looks clear," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can rest here for a bit." I lowered Miller to the ground, careful not to jostle him too much. He winced, his face contorting in pain, but he didn't make a sound. I knelt beside him, checking the makeshift bandage on his side. The bleeding had slowed, but he was still in bad shape. His skin was clammy, his breath shallow. We needed to get him back to camp, but I wasn't sure how much farther he could go. Tommy crouched next to me, his face grim. "We can't stay here long," he said. "They'll come back once they figure out we're gone." I nodded, wiping the sweat from my face with a trembling hand. "We need to keep moving." Tommy looked at Miller, his jaw tightening. "He's not going to make it if we don't get help soon." "I know," I said, my voice cracking. "But we can't carry him all the way back. Not like this." Tommy didn't respond. He just stared at me, the weight of the situation heavy in his eyes. We were out of options, out of time, and the jungle wasn't done with us yet. We didn't have the luxury of sitting there and debating. The enemy wasn't going to stay away for long. Every second we wasted felt like a countdown to something worse. I glanced at Miller, who was barely holding on, and then at Tommy, who looked just as torn as I felt. The clearing offered a brief reprieve, but it wasn't safety. It was a trap waiting to happen. "All right," I said, taking a deep breath. "Here's the plan. I'll stay with Miller. You head back to camp and bring reinforcements. We'll hold out as long as we can." Tommy's eyes widened. "Are you out of your damn mind, Jim? Splitting up out here is suicide." I shook my head. "We don't have a choice. You know as well as I do that Miller won't make it back if we drag him through that jungle. He needs a stretcher, maybe even medevac. You're faster without us slowing you down." He hesitated, his face torn between anger and fear. "If I leave you here, you might not make it either." I forced a grim smile. "Then you better hurry." Tommy cursed under his breath, glancing toward the thick trees beyond the clearing. Finally he nodded. "All right, but you better keep him alive until I get back. You hear me?" "Loud and clear," I said, gripping his arm briefly before letting go. Tommy slung his rifle over his shoulder and disappeared into the jungle, moving as quickly and quietly as he could. I watched him go, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. Alone, the jungle felt even more oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made my nerves snap tight. I turned my attention back to Miller. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy and unfocused. "Jim," he rasped, barely audible. "I'm here, Sarge," I said, adjusting the bandage on his side. The bleeding had slowed even more, but his breathing was shallow and labored. He wasn't in good shape, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered right now. He tried to speak again, but his voice was too weak. "Save your strength," I told him, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Tommy's gone to get help. We're going to get you out of here." Miller's hand twitched, gripping weakly at my arm. His fingers were ice cold, and I could see the fear in his eyes. I gave him a firm nod, trying to reassure him. "You're not dying here. Not today." I propped him up as best as I could, positioning him behind a fallen log for cover. The clearing wasn't much of a defensible position, but it was all we had. I checked my rifle, counting the magazines I had left. Not many. If the enemy came back before Tommy returned, I'd be in for the fight of my life. Time passed in a strange, agonizing way. Minutes felt like hours. The jungle around us was eerily quiet, but I knew better than to trust that silence. The Viet Cong could be anywhere, watching, waiting. I kept my rifle trained on the trees, my finger hovering over the trigger. My ears strained for any sound, any hint that we were no longer alone. Then it happened. A branch snapped, faint but distinct. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it would give me away. Another sound followed, the soft rustle of leaves, too deliberate to be the wind. They were here. I gripped my rifle tighter, pressing myself low against the log. Miller was motionless beside me, his breathing so faint I could barely hear it. I couldn't let him down. I couldn't let either of us die out here. The first figure emerged from the shadows, moving cautiously, their AK-47 raised. They were skilled, disciplined. I waited, holding my breath, my sights trained on the spot where they'd stepped into view. Behind him, another figure appeared, and then a third. My palms were slick with sweat, my muscles tense as I calculated my chances. 3 of them. 3 against 1, with Miller out of commission. The odds weren't great, but I'd faced worse. I exhaled slowly, steadying my aim. When the first soldier stepped closer, I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the quiet jungle. The man dropped, and chaos erupted. The other 2 shouted in surprise, diving for cover. I didn't give them a chance to regroup. I fired again, hitting one of them in the leg. He fell with a scream, clutching his knee. The third soldier returned fire, the bullets snapping past me so close I could feel the heat. I ducked behind the log, my heart racing. I had to end this quickly. If more of them were nearby, we wouldn't stand a chance. Peeking out, I caught sight of the last soldier repositioning, his rifle raised. I aimed and fired, the shot striking true. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. Silence fell again, broken only by the ringing in my ears and the sound of my ragged breathing. I stayed crouched, scanning the area for any sign of movement. When nothing came, I finally let myself breathe. I turned to Miller, who was barely conscious but still alive. "We made it, Sarge," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "We're gonna make it." But in my gut, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. The quiet after the firefight was worse than the noise. My ears still rang from the gunshots, and every rustle of the jungle felt like it could explode into chaos again. I stayed low, gripping my rifle, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing stirred. For the moment, at least, we were alone. I turned my attention back to Miller. He looked even worse than before, his skin pale and clammy. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and his lips were slightly parted as if he were struggling for air. The blood on his side had slowed to a dark stain, but that didn't mean he was out of danger. I knew we were running out of time. "Sarge," I said, gently shaking his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. He tried to say something, but his voice was too weak. I leaned closer, straining to hear him. "You leave me," he rasped, barely audible. "Get out." I shook my head firmly, gripping his arm. "Not a chance. You're coming with me." He gave a weak shake of his head, his lips forming a faint, bitter smile. It was like he knew something I didn't, like he had already accepted what I refused to. But I wasn't about to let him give up. Not after everything we'd been through. "Tommy's coming back," I told him, my voice low but steady. "You just have to hang on a little longer." He didn't respond. His eyes drifted closed again, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd lost him. But then his chest rose, shallow and weak, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I didn't dare move from our cover, didn't dare make a sound. The jungle around us stayed quiet, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that warned you danger wasn't far away. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint sound of movement, too far to make out clearly, but enough to set my nerves on edge. It could have been Tommy, coming back with reinforcements. Or it could have been the enemy, returning to finish what they'd started. Either way, I had to be ready. I tightened my grip on my rifle, every muscle in my body tense. The sound grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I positioned myself behind the log, ready to fire at the first sign of trouble. The bushes parted, and for a split second, I froze. Then I saw him, Tommy, his face smeared with sweat and dirt, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Behind him were 2 other soldiers from our squad, their eyes scanning the jungle for threats. Relief washed over me so quickly it left me dizzy. "Jim," Tommy called in a harsh whisper, jogging toward us. He dropped to his knees beside me, his eyes darting to Miller. "How's he doing?" "Not good," I admitted, my voice shaking. We need to get him out of here. Tommy nodded, his jaw tight. We got a stretcher. Found a medic back at the camp, but he couldn't come out. Said we'd have to bring Miller to him. The two other soldiers set down a makeshift stretcher made of bamboo poles and canvas. We worked quickly, lifting Miller as gently as we could. He groaned in pain, but didn't wake. Every movement felt like it took an eternity, but we finally got him secured. We've got to move, Tommy said, his voice low and urgent. The gunfire's going to draw more of them. We stay here, we're dead. I nodded, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. The two soldiers took the front and back of the stretcher, carrying Miller between them. Tommy and I took point, our rifles raised as we moved through the jungle. The journey back was grueling. The jungle felt alive around us, every shadow hiding potential danger. My nerves were shot, my body running on pure adrenaline. The weight of everything we'd been through pressed down on me, but I couldn't let it slow me down. We had to keep going. The camp came into view just as the sun began to rise, casting a faint, golden light through the trees. The sight of it was like a punch to the chest, a reminder that we'd made it this far. But the fight wasn't over. We rushed Miller to the medic's tent, where the corpsman immediately started working on him. I stood outside the tent with Tommy, both of us too wired to sit but too exhausted to move. We didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. The weight of the night hung heavy in the air between us. After what felt like hours, the medic came out. His face was grim, but there was a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. He's stable for now, he said. Lost a lot of blood, but he'll make it. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. Tommy clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. You did good, Jim, he said quietly. We all did. I nodded, the reality of it all finally sinking in. We'd survived. Against all odds, we'd made it through the night. But as I looked out at the jungle, I knew this wasn't the end. The war wasn't over. Not for me, not for Tommy, not for Miller. There were more nights like this ahead, more battles to fight, more lives to save. But for now, we had this small victory. And in a place like Vietnam, sometimes that was all you could hope for.